MMI Topic 12, Microbiomes, Infections, and Disease. So the human body is an ecosystem. I know we like to think about us all the time. It's us, us, us. But think about all the trillions of bacteria and viruses that are on your body. Take a look at these numbers. We have maybe about 30 trillion human cells in the body. Bigger people, a few more. Smaller people, maybe a few less. But we probably have at least that many bacterial cells in our own body, and that doesn't include viruses and fungi or anything like that. If you take a look at just the genetic qualities of this, humans have about 20,000 genes. These bacteria, since there's so many species, we're looking at many, many more, probably millions and millions of genes and gene products and all sorts of interesting things that they're doing. Think about the consequences of that. This is a true ecosystem. We're interacting with these microbes all the time. They have a huge effect on our health. Some of them can actually be good for us. They develop our immune system. Some of them are actually bad for us. They can cause all sorts of diseases. This is what we're going to be talking about a little bit in this particular topic. So some words for you: microflora, microbiota, and microbiome. What are these things? These are really referring to all the organisms that are living on and in us. And these terms in particular, they have slightly different meanings, but it doesn't really matter what the differences are. Microflora is an older term. Some people don't like flora because flora means plants. So a lot of people like to use microbiota instead. The new term that most people are using is microbiome. This is inspired by the word genome, because nowadays we can detect the presence of organisms by detecting their DNA, even if we can't grow them in a lab. So what are we talking about? I mentioned 30 to 50 trillion bacteria, possibly 10 times that many in terms of viruses. We're also talking about fungi and yeasts, archaeal organisms, protists, and even animals. Yes, animals. Wait till we talk about those eyelash mites. So these organisms that make our microbiome, some of them are resident flora, so that means they're there, they colonize us, and they live with us all the time. So an example of this is Staphylococcus epidermidis. There's also transient flora. Transient flora live with us, sometimes they come and go. So Staphylococcus aureus is a good example of this. Maybe we have it about a third or a quarter of the time. So a lot of these microorganisms are good for us. They might make vitamins for us. They help us digest food, like lactose if we drink milk. A lot of them will make conditions unsuitable for pathogens. We'll talk about that later on. That's called microbial antagonism. And a bunch of them induce immunity, meaning that they're essential for the proper development of our immune system. Of course, many are bad. We're talking about opportunistic infections. They may produce toxins that cause us harm or disease. So how do we get this microbiome? How do we get all these microorganisms? It turns out that when we're a fetus, we're probably sterile. There are some studies that may indicate otherwise, but mostly we don't have any organisms in or on us. As soon as the woman's water breaks, the placenta breaks, microorganisms go flooding in, and the baby starts to get exposed to organisms on its face, on its skin, and otherwise. A significant source of many of the baby's microorganisms include the vagina. As the baby passes through the birth canal, it's going to absorb microbes on the skin, it's going to absorb microbes on the mouth. It turns out that babies that undergo cesarean sections actually have different microbiomes, at least initially, than babies who have vaginal births. And in fact, babies who have vaginal births seem to have a lower rate of asthma. Not a huge amount, but significant enough that it can be measured by studies. So maybe in the future we'll have some sort of probiotic for C-section babies to treat asthma, or at least try to prevent it a little bit. Of course, the baby, once it starts consuming food, it might breastfeed or feed from a bottle. It's going to get organisms from that. It's going to be touched by people, touch their skin. Babies like to put things in their mouth, and all these things are going to lead to colonization. Some microorganisms take a few months to colonize, some are a lot quicker, some are a lot slower. And of course, there's a variety of things that can cause differences, such as diet and things like that. Lifestyle, temperature, humidity can all affect what microorganisms a baby is exposed to. So as we age, the organisms on our body can change. We have, like I said, lots of lifestyle choices or genetic choices, or even men and women may have different complements of microorganisms on their bodies. So where do these organisms live? Just about everywhere. Hair, nostrils, skin, vagina, oral cavity, esophagus, stomach, and colon. Not usually in the blood, not usually in the lower respiratory tract, but all over the body. And we're going to talk about most of these places. So let's talk about the skin, or the conjunctiva. Conjunctiva is just the surface of the eye, and usually it has a lot of the same organisms that might be found in the skin. So the skin is relatively dry and salty. So as a consequence, only certain organisms are found there in high numbers. A lot of organisms may be found there in small numbers, or they may be found dead. So we're talking about the Staphylococcus. These organisms really do well in dry and salty conditions, and also Candida, that is yeast. So let's talk a little bit about Staphylococcus. Like I said, Staphylococcus is a really successful skin organism. There's 3 species worth discussion. Staphylococcus epidermidis can cause some skin infections and a few other infections. Mostly it's commensal. It's found on all of us all the time. It's a resident flora. Staphylococcus aureus is, of course, the one that we're very concerned about. It's a transient flora, and it can cause many, many significant and very serious infections. One more Staphylococcus was only discovered a few years ago. It's called Staphylococcus hominis. So what's the big deal about this one? Turns out this one can cause BO, body odor. So if we have good hygiene, we can get rid of at least some of these ones and maybe reduce our odors. Some people with bad BO, for some reason their body tends to preferentially grow this organism a bit more than others. So I had mentioned eyelash mites. Here's an animal that lives on us, or is likely to live on you eventually, because you're more likely to be colonized as you get older. These are eyelash mites. So mites are little 8-legged animals and little critters that can live on us. Can you see them? Take a look. There's some eyelashes. I'll zoom in. There we go. See those little yellow things? Those are the eyelash mites. They're burrowing their ways into the hair follicles. Here's an even better picture. I know they're a little creepy and a little crawly, but hey, they're microscopic, and if they're there, I can't feel them. So let's talk about some of the places that microorganisms colonize and some of the potential pathogens. So the upper respiratory tract, so we're talking about the nose and the mouth and the throat. This area is actually very, very rich with organisms. We have a lot of moisture there, and of course we're stuffing things into our mouth and our nose all the time. Our mouth probably has hundreds of different organisms. Many of them are not culturable. Some of them are causing us dental disease, and some of us are causing us other diseases. Many of them are causing us no harm whatsoever. These organisms change on a daily basis. You know, after you brush your teeth, use mouthwash, spicy food versus bland food. All these things can change what is found in those parts of the body. Let's take a look at some of the organisms. So notice this list. We're going to see Staphylococcus, Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Streptococcus. These organisms are found almost on every single list. They seem to colonize every part of the body. You can see Neisseria is found here as well. Neisseria meningitidis is the one that we're talking about. In terms of pathogens, Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, and of course Candida, so that's causing thrush. Before we move on, what about the lower respiratory system? The data does show that there are some organisms in there, but the numbers are very, very low. Some textbooks will even say that the lungs are sterile unless you have an infection like pneumonia. I believe the research is showing there are small numbers of bacteria and viruses in there, and they're not causing us harm until they reach certain numbers. But generally, the lungs are going to be kept clear. We have little cilia and mucus in our esophagus and our trachea, that are basically they're trapping organisms and pushing it up and out through the back of our throat. So let's talk about Candida. Candida is a yeast, and it can inhabit many parts of the body. There's a picture of it, and you can see the yeast. Some of the yeast are budding. And one of the common infections from Candida is, of course, thrush, which is common in infants, and sometimes people with other complications such as HIV and AIDS. We can also get Candida infections of the vagina, which is vaginal yeast infection or vaginitis. So what about the digestive tract? So we get past the mouth, down the esophagus, and we have many, many organisms in the small, large intestine. A few in the stomach, mostly they're just passing through. So here's some of the organisms here. You can see the large intestine. We've got, there it is, Staphylococcus again, and there's E. coli. So there's some organisms that we know. What pathogens are we talking about? So E. coli, there are pathogenic E. colis. There are Clostridiums. There's our Candida again. And you can see we also have Entamoeba and Trichomonas and Entamoeba again as well. So those are some protist pathogens. So there are many, many organisms that live or at least go through the gut. You can see the big list here. We're talking about Firmicutes and Bacteroides. These are really just gram-positives and gram-negative groups. Some of the organisms you may recognize: Bacillus, Clostridium, Lactobacillus, Staphylococcus, gram-positives. The gram-negatives you may recognize: E. coli and Pseudomonas. So what can we say about these organisms? They're a big part of the dry weight of our fecal matter. Like I said, hundreds of organisms, maybe even more than 1,000. And apparently when you have a bowel movement, that's about 100 trillion bacterial cells. Wow. Think about it. Think about how many bacterial cells are emitted by humans on a daily basis. If there's 7 billion of us on the planet. Incredible. Turns out E. coli is just a small part of this. A fraction of our fecal matter is E. coli. Why do we talk so much about E. coli? Well, because E. coli is actually super easy to grow in a lab and very easy to detect. So because it's easy to grow in a lab, it's an excellent organism for studying fecal matter and all sorts of other aspects of biology. So here's just another slide showing that our composition of microbiome in our gut changes as we age, and you can see they're shown in these pie charts and showing the different variations as we go from infant to child to adult to elderly. So what about our urinary tract and reproductive systems? So urinary tract, we're talking about the urethra and we're talking about the bladder. These areas here are for the most part relatively sterile, at least the bladder is. The urethra might have small numbers of organisms in there and a few more around the surface of the urethra. The reason for this is pretty much just a one-way system. We have urine that is getting expelled by the bladder, and the mechanical forces of the urination are going to blow out a lot of bacteria outwards and not inwards. Sometimes we get infections, and these can be quite painful, but for the most part, these, like I said, the bladder is going to be sterile. The urethra might have a few organisms. There's also the vagina. I'll talk about the vagina in a moment. I want to just show this list here of common flora of the urethra. We've got Staphylococcus again, and there's Pseudomonas. So the same organisms keep popping up again and again. So the vagina is actually the opposite of the bladder in that it has actually a very rich complement of microorganisms. There's a lot of moisture there. It's not necessarily a one-way passage, and as a consequence, a lot of bacteria grow there. The big one that's important, we don't really need to know too much about it for this class, is this one here, Lactobacillus. So Lactobacillus, the full name is Lactobacillus acidophilus. And so that means it produces an acid, and this is actually really important for vaginal health. That acid is produced by the bacteria. If the bacteria is thriving, then the vagina is an acidic environment and actually inhibits growth of a lot of other organisms such as yeast and the yeast Candida. When women take antibiotics, or sometimes even from their menstrual cycles, it can affect the lactobacillus population and therefore lead to yeast infections or other infections if other organisms get a chance to overgrow. So here's some potential pathogens. You can see the list is the same ones we've been talking about already. There are some pathogenic E. coli. There's Staphylococcus on the list. We have some sexually transmitted infections as well, chlamydia, Neisseria, gonorrhea, treponema, that's syphilis. You can see on the female urogenital system, we're also adding candida as well for vaginal yeast infections. So I mentioned before that some of the organisms of our microbiome actually protect us against other potential pathogens. This is a process that we call microbial antagonism. This means that microbes really just compete for nutrients as a part of an ecosystem and as part of our body. So how did they do this? Probably the biggest thing is just by occupying niches. It's really just if you're in this space, other people can't take that space. And it's the same with microorganisms. You can see my little cartoon here. We've got this green microorganism, and he says, "Hey, get off our turf." And the little pink guy says, "There's no place for me." So it doesn't mean the pathogens aren't there. It just means they're not there in sufficient numbers to grow and cause disease, like Clostridium difficile. Some of them actually produce things like acids. So I mentioned the lactobacillus found in the vagina produces acids. That's a good example of that and inhibits the growth of other organisms. Some of them produce something called bacteriocins. So take a look at this word. Anytime you see IN on the end of a word, it means a protein. So these are proteins that inhibit other species of bacteria. So it's produced by one bacteria to inhibit the growth of other bacterial species. So it's just one way that they stake out their territory and prevent other species from growing. So this leads us to talk about probiotics. So the idea of probiotics has been around for a while, but it's really only been popularized now for about 20 years. And this is the idea that we can eat or apply bacteria to our bodies, and it can actually promote some sort of human health. Here's some examples. Activia is a big one. This one's been around for a while. You can go to their website and you can read about all their claims and all the good things Activia will do. Mostly they're talking about digestive health. Danone also produces this one here called Dan Active. You can see it says immunity right on it, so they're making some claims that it's going to do some boosting to your immune system. There are all sorts of products I've found out there. I saw this one last year and I found on the internet. I don't know what all their claims are, but it's not just yogurts. There are many other products out there. So this chocolate bar of some sort. How about this one? I found this one in the airport. I was going to buy a package of gum and I saw this and took a picture of it. You can see it says here, the friendly bacteria. So what are its claims? So I went on their website and I found a little bit of information about them, and they're talking about if you get traveler's diarrhea, that this may actually alleviate the symptoms or maybe prevent traveler's diarrhea. So the whole idea is you're going to eat the friendly bacteria and hopefully that will get rid of the unfriendly bacteria. Here's another product I found in the grocery store, something marketed towards toddlers, so baby puppies. These are probiotics. I don't know what their claims are either. I haven't actually looked them up, but you can see it says on the bag 1 billion probiotics per serving. So there are a lot of claims about these organisms and these probiotics. I just wanted to show you this. I found this on Vogue.com. They're talking about the different organisms. We have lactobacillus. It says here it supports digestion. Yes, for sure. Immune functions, maybe. Reduces anxiety. Not sure if there's any good data on that. Bifidobacterium helps digest fiber, and then it's talking about regulating blood sugar and brain function. So again, these are questionable claims. Saccharomyces, antibacterial, and so on. So I made this table for you, kind of going over some of the data, and you can see that the best claims are involved with intestinal health. Notice I have these yeses over here. Little yeses are kind of okay, and big yeses are definitely. So reducing risks of traveler's diarrhea, probably for some people. What about other aspects of health? Yes, in terms of digestive health, definitely they can help us out. Clostridium difficile infections, you get the right bacteria and you can actually alleviate those symptoms. What about Crohn's disease? We're not sure. Big maybe on that. You can see topic 2 I have on here is urogenital infections. So we're talking about vaginal yeast infections. There's actually a few good studies on this that show for some women. So some women get these reoccurring yeast infections, and for some of them taking probiotics does help. but not everybody. Everybody's a little different genetically, and other ways. We're all a little different. So a lot of probiotics will work for some people and not other people, which is why it's really hard to evaluate the health claims. So what about the immune system? A little bit of a question mark here. There are a lot of immune cells in your gut, maybe more immune cells than anywhere else in the body. Whether probiotics can help, the jury's out on that one. What about other health areas? Can they actually help colds, allergies, eczema? We're going to put a couple big question marks here. Really, we don't know. The data just is not there yet. One question to ask is whether probiotics actually affect our health in a bad way. That's something else that the research needs to look at. We'll probably find out a lot in the next few years, maybe 10 or 20 years about these probiotics. At the moment, just keep in mind there's a lot of question marks around this research, and it's very hard to do because it seems to work for some people and then other people it does not. One type of probiotic, or it's not usually called a probiotic, but at least it's the same idea of applying good bacteria, that has had a lot of success is a fecal transplant. You can see I'm calling here a transposition. So there's a little joke for you. So these fecal transplants are used in the case of treating sometimes people with Clostridium difficile. So a lot of people who get Clostridium difficile, they will get antibiotics and then they won't get cleared up, and they'll take a second course, sometimes a third course, and this is really rough on the system. Taking 3 courses of antibiotics, it's just destroying their normal microbiome, causing all sorts of health problems. And we're looking at, recovery can take, a long time. We're looking at weeks and months. So something that was started to be studied in the 1950s, believe it or not, it's done in horses, are these fecal transplants. So you get a healthy donor, so maybe a spouse or a sister or brother, they give a fecal sample, it gets cleaned up and rinsed in saline solution, usually screened for other diseases, and it's given to the person. Either in the top end or the bottom end. There's cases where they're using tubes or capsules or enemas, lots of different methods for doing it. And it turns out, take a look at this, 95% success rate. This is huge. 5 years ago, very few doctors in Canada were doing this. Now there's a much larger number because of these studies showing that the success rate is massive. There are people looking at these fecal transplants now to even treat other diseases and wondering whether it can help with Crohn's disease or celiac disease or a whole variety of other things, even autism, believe it or not. So let's talk about Clostridium difficile. So Clostridium difficile, as we mentioned, can cause a diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and other things, and there it is. You can see this note here, it's the most common infectious cause of nosocomial diarrhea. So there we are, there's somebody, and they've got a gut, and they're taking some antibiotics, and the antibiotics are affecting their gut flora. One of the big offenders here is clindamycin. Lots of people have problems with clindamycin. It's so powerful, it wipes out so many of the normal bacterial flora. Notice the Clostridium here has these endospores, and these endospores are going to survive. Here we go, and now Clostridium difficile has grown up and he looks pretty nasty, flourishing within the colon. Eventually Clostridium releases some toxins. These cause damage and fluid loss in the intestine, which lead to this really nasty smelling diarrhea. So Clostridium difficile is a good example of what we call an opportunistic infection. So what does this mean? It means that sometimes circumstances change, which leads an organism that's living with a person not causing disease, and suddenly it's now causing disease. So there are quite a few examples of where these opportunities exist. I've really grouped it into 4 categories. One is immune suppression. So sometimes people, you can imagine somebody who's getting an organ transplant, or maybe they're elderly, or AIDS is a good example. AIDS patients, they're susceptible to all sorts of weird fungal infections and cancers and things like that that normal healthy people don't actually get. Changes in normal flora, so I mentioned the antibiotic-induced diarrhea with Clostridium. I also mentioned the antibiotic-induced vaginal yeast infections. Sometimes bacteria get introduced from one site to another. So a good example of that is E. coli, which is normally a fecal bacteria found in the colon, and it can sometimes get introduced to the urethra and cause a bladder infection. The fourth category, I kind of call it other, meaning there's lots of other complications people might have. A good example is cystic fibrosis. This is a genetic disorder where people have extra mucus in their lungs, which can unfortunately lead to sometimes serious respiratory infections. Here's a list of some of the other opportunities that are mentioned in the textbook. You can see things like surgical patients or transplant patients or whatever. There's a huge long list of where opportunistic infections may occur. So this leads us to the end of Part A. I've already done Part B of this particular topic, and this is actually the last video lecture I'll be doing for this class, so I hope that you've enjoyed them. I hope you've gotten a little bit out of them. Clearly they're not as good as the in-person classes at the college, but at the same time I'm hoping I did a good job at them. Thank you for taking my class this semester. I've enjoyed all of your questions, and I hope I will see you in the future in the hallways. And please do come ask me if you have any questions or even microbiology stories. I would love to hear all about them. I hope you all do well this summer and that you stay healthy and that your families stay healthy as well. Have a great day and take care.